As is well known, the notion and the ideal of episteme, defined by Aristotle in his posterior analytics, deeply influenced Western intellectual tradition. Causal knowledge, that is, the definition of certain knowledge as knowledge based on the identification of the cause, became the cornerstone for the development of natural philosophy and the study of nature. It has been noted, however, that the causal requirement could become, in certain cases, an excessive demand for propositions about the natural world. Demanding an explicit and precise identification of causes could diminish the value or even nullify whole bodies of knowledge, bodies that, while useful, were not able to provide an adequate identification of causation. Just to make a very modern parenthesis, we can know that phenomenon A is correlated with phenomenon B, and this is a very modern language, of course, a phenomenon B without knowing the causal connection, if there is one. Okay. Some areas, medicine is a notable example, but not exclusive. Meteorology is another, etc. Some areas accumulated along the centuries vast masses of useful and valid knowledge for which causes could not be easily identified, if at all. In this presentation, I will look at early modern Problemata literature from this point of view. I want to argue that by legitimizing an approach that left open the issue of causation, the Problemata genre was to a great extent a way of escaping the stringencies of the Aristotelian requirement and at the same time of promoting discussion. I will use as guide for my argument one book, the Problematum libri quinque, by a Portuguese physician and scholar, António Luís. The book was well known in the 16th century, and its influence can be discerned even later. Just to give one example, it is cited in Robert Burton's famous Anatomy of Melancholy, whose first edition is from 1621. Luís himself was quite famous during his life. António Luís, the author, was born in Lisbon in the early years of the 16th century. We do not know the exact date. He was the son of a well-respected physician whose career was marked by a number of distinctions and privileges, despite the fact that he was a Jewish convert, a so-called new Christian. António Luís followed his father's steps. He studied medicine at the University of Salamanca in Spain, obtaining his bachelor degree in August 1532. In that same year, he returned to Portugal and got the degree of licentiate, so a next degree which gives allowance, permit to teach. So he got the degree of licentiate in medicine in 1533. He did not pursue studies for a doctorate, which is somewhat surprising, given that by those years his fame as a man of great erudition was already well established. About his production, a brief summary. In 1537, his first book was published in Antwerp. It was a compilation, he titles it Enchiridion, that is a manual of different works, and I quote his words, extracted from the varied and very abundant history of the Greeks, that is, related to the Greek historical, moral, and literary tradition. The most important of the works contained in that compilation is De Pudore, about shame, so more or less a moral treatise. But other works comment on authors as diverse as Plato, Aristotle, many classical philosophers, Michael Psellos, etc. There is not exactly any scientific content in this first work. In February 1539, António Luís had a brush with the Inquisition, which, although unpleasant, turned out to be rather benign, at least comparatively to other cases. Following an accusation by his landlady, by a minor money affair, he spent a few days in prison but was rapidly freed and acquitted of all charges. This already notes that by 1549 he had, good connections, and I mean his name was on a very good standing. After this unpleasant episode, Luís started a remarkable burst of literary activity, publishing 4 books in very rapid succession at the most reputed printing shop in Lisbon. Panegyrica Oratio was published in 1539 at the printing shop of Luís Rodrigues, a very famous printer. It is a lengthy and rhetorical eloge of the Portuguese king, John III, and commenting diverse facts about the history of Portugal. In 1539, this is the date at the title page, but in fact, the colophon at the end is signed with the date of January 1540. I will use the date as at the title page. So at the end, at the turn of the year from 39 to 40, he published the Problematum libri quinque, which is the book that we'll be talking about and I will describe in detail below. The next year, or later in 1540, he published De Occultis Proprietatibus Libri Quinque, and in this book, he included also a second edition of De Pudore that he had published some years before. De Occultis Proprietatibus, it's a verbose but very traditional comment on the so-called occult properties. It is traditional in the sense that the author keeps very closely to the Hippocratic and Galenic notions. For example, magnetism is explained as the temperature of primary qualities, etc. In 1540, at the end of the year, he published his largest book, De Re Medica. It is a lengthy and learned collection of commentaries and discussions on various works of Galen, a typical, production on the theoretical aspects and the major authors of medicine. After this book, De Re Medica, António Luís will publish nothing else. So his publishing activity is very circumscribed in time, but it was very intense in those more or less 2 years in which he published, a few years in which he published. In January 1547, he was appointed to teach medicine in Greek. So this was the name. That is, according to the university statutes, he had to teach a number of hours on Aristotle and a number of hours on Galen and comment on these two authors. Despite his fame and the recognition that he enjoyed at the university, this period while teaching at the university was very brief. In fact, it lasted only 2 years, until January 1549. After that date, his name does not appear more in the university records. More than that, after 1549, his historical record is only what can be grasped from the correspondence, his correspondent good network of contacts that he maintained with the leading Portuguese scholars of the period, both living in Portugal, in the country, and abroad. It is believed that Luís died around 1565, but we do not have precise information. António Luís never practiced as a medical doctor, although the titles of his books present him as medicus. He described himself to be a philosopher and a scholar. He was a scholarly doctor with a deep interest in medical literature, a literary man, a man of texts and ideas. Now I would like to spend some moments talking about, after this presentation of the author, talking about the Problemata tradition. I'm sure that for many of those that are attending, this will be covering already known ground, but maybe to others there will be some novelty in this. I don't presume to, at this stage, to bring any novelty, but it's important to have everybody, in tune with what I'm talking about. By the early 17th century, an important intellectual tradition, imposing and rich in texts, had begun to disappear. I am referring, of course, to the tradition of the so-called problems, sometimes also called problems of Aristotle, Problemata, Problemata Aristotelis, very many different names. These texts had been widely disseminated in the West during the Middle Ages and until the end of the 16th century. But by early 17th century, they began slowly to disappear from the intellectual world of Europe. The Problemata Aristotelis were never unknown to historians and are well inscribed in the Aristotelian corpus. They can be found, for example, in the Becker, Berlin edition, the standard edition of the Aristotelian books. But they were mostly ignored by historiography for many decades. In the 19th century, there is little more than to record than a lecture by Karl Prandtl in 1850. And in the first half of the 20th century, only a brief study by the distinguished classicist E.S. Forster in 1928. These are the only really noteworthy things at this period. However, the situation has changed considerably in the last 30 years, during which an important body of studies and editions were published. The three-volume edition of the Problem in Belles Lettres, so the French edition, the Problem, published between 1991 and 1994, deserves a special mention. In 1999, the Harvard historian Anne Blair published two important studies that, in a way, relaunched the discussion and the interest on this subject. Finally, I would note in 2006, the collection of studies Aristotle's Problemata in Different Times and Tongues, edited by Peter Leemans and Michele Goyens, was released to the public. And this, I believe, is the most up-to-date set of studies regarding these texts that we have today. These that I have mentioned were the central contributions, I would say, but around them, a series of many other studies appeared recently. But I will not summarize them. I think it is safe to say that in the past decades, we have been witnessing a clear growth of interest in this literary genre. And my talk today is nothing more but a very modest contribution within this collective effort. To begin with, what exactly are the problems attributed to Aristotle? I will summarize by, and paraphrase the description that was given many years ago by Forster. The Problems is a compilation of almost 900 questions or problems grouped into 38 thematic sections or books. Books 1 through 11 deal with medical and physiological issues. Here are treated topics as diverse as medicine, some bodily functions such as sweating, for example, and also drunkenness, sexual relations, fatigue, etc. Books 12 to 13 deal with odors, pleasant and unpleasant. Book 14 deals with temperament. The themes vary considerably in the following books. Book 15 deals with mathematics, and 16 and the 17 books with animate and inanimate things. In Book 18, issues of literature are analyzed, and in Book 19, music. Books 20 to 22 deal with matters of botany, and books 23 to 26 address physical issues and properties such as, the properties of salt water, hot water, air, wind, etc. Books 27 to 30 treat moral qualities, fear, courage, temperance and intemperance, justice and injustice, wisdom, etc. Finally, there is a group, books 31 to 38, that deal with different parts of the body. In sum, it is a broad and large collection of subjects, but with a clear predominance of topics related to medicine, biology, and natural history. The authorship of the text that has come down to us raises some problems. That is to say, there is no doubt that Aristotle wrote some problemata. They are cited in other works by himself and by others, but the version that we have today is the result of a much later compilation, introducing other materials and presumably eliminating some. Again, E.S. Foster summarizes the matter in the following terms. To sum up, the problems appear to consist, firstly, of an Aristotelian element derived in part from the genuine Physica Problemata of Aristotle, and in part from scraps of Aristotelian doctrine from the genuine works recast in problem form. Secondly, a Hippocratic element. Thirdly, a Theophrastian element. And lastly, a miscellaneous element which cannot be further defined than as being, in the main at least, peripatetic in character. The most recent research agrees with this judgment by Forster, but slightly broadens the designation, stating that, and I quote, the Problemata Aristotelis are a set of texts gradually assembled by the peripatetic school sometime before the 6th century AD, and which were imitated by Soranus, Plutarch, Cassius the Iatropist, and the pseudo-Alexander Aphrodisias. The thematic range of the Problemata is very large, as has been said, and for this reason the text was welcomed in all intellectual traditions or in those historical moments during which encyclopedic knowledge was especially valued. But it is not mainly because of the variety of themes treated that the text is interesting. The text is interesting, first of all, because of the very specific way in which subjects are presented and discussed. Leaving aside the question about the knowledge and the circulation of those texts in antiquity, the Problemata entered the Latin world around 1300 when they were translated into Latin. They then had a wide dissemination in manuscript. This transmission was always made in the conviction that Aristotle was the author, because it was only in the 16th century that the question of authorship arose. Apparently, it was the Valencian Juan Luis Vives the first to point out that Aristotle was not the author of that compilation of questions. There are two Latin manuscript traditions which arose from the Aristotelian problems, but which always appear separately in the manuscripts. First of all, there are the Problemata Aristotelis, 900 questions in 38 books. Fragments of this are known, called Vetustissima Translatio, which circulated between the 9th and 13th centuries and which served as model for the questions of Salerno. The most complete translations of the Problemata was made by Bartolomeo da Messina between 1258 and 1266. Copies of Bartolomeo's translation are often accompanied by the Expositio Problematum Aristotelis, a famous commentary by Pietro d'Abano, the celebrated author of the Conciliator Differentiarum Philosophorum et Praecipe Medicorum. Pietro's Expositio was completed at Padua in 1310 and was for long the standard work on the Aristotelian problems. Authors and commentators were quite free to make changes and introduce their own points of view. They could alter not only the original problems or questions in the Aristotelian Problemata, but even the very spirit of the work. Thus, for example, the Expositio of Pietro d'Abano shows a pervasive presence of astrology, and this is in marked contrast with the original Aristotelian problems, where there is none. A second tradition, which Brian Lawn identified by its incipit omnes homines, also circulated with many additions and variations. This was a considerably smaller text of around 250 problems instead of the original 900 questions of the Aristotelian text. The origin of and authorship of this version is not known, most likely from the German area in the 13th or 14th century. Anne Blair, who studied the editorial fortuna of these texts, designates the first of these traditions as the high or learned version and the second as the low version, more popular. And she documented the many editions, the extreme, popularity, and even the vernacular versions of the low version, a very well-known text. Let us now go to the book that I'm interested in, the Problematum libri quinque by António Luís. So the complete title, in translation would go like 5 books on problems by António Luís, a Lisbon physician, medicus, a perfect work, eloquent and varied, very rich in multiform erudition. In the preface of the book, the author tells the reader that the work had already been written some years ago, but only now, and I quote, profiting from a period of leisure, he had decided to publish it. He then explains how the book was prepared. And this was from his many and varied readings, especially of Greek authors. He, and I quote, collected everything that was the most precise and well established, transcribing everything that seemed more remarkable and extraordinary. End of quote. Thus he continues in his typical grandiloquent and convoluted style, and I quote again, supported in intelligence, richness of style, and varied reading, I prepared this work, rich in facts, judicious and in good style, that in a few pages comprises many and the most profound arcana of science, the knowledge of which, by other means, would demand long periods of time, much work, and no small resources. End of quote. Therefore, and I quote again, whoever desires to know much in a short period of time and without having to read much will not be bored, if I am not mistaken, for concentrating in this book. End of quote. This characterization of his role as author is a clear understatement of his real intervention. Luís gave a very deliberate and specific new form to the matters that he collected from his sources. A second aspect to note is perhaps even more interesting. The objective of the book, at least the explicit objective of the book, seems to be rather prosaic. The author explains that this is a book for those that desire to know much in a short period of time and without having to read much. Thus, the ideal reader is pictured as a non-expert and a somewhat lazy reader. This is surprising. It is completely at odds with the grandiloquent style, the convoluted Latin, and even the physical aspect of the book. This is a book of high-quality typographical production, elegant composition, and, produced at the most celebrated printing shop in Lisbon. This is a book that announces not only erudition, but also authority. It is not a book for novices, turones, nor students or the lazy reader. A final observation is also in order. The book is written for a broad audience, let us say an educated reader, and not specifically for the medical profession. It is also unrelated to any educational context. It appears to me that it signals the widening of the readership of Problemata literature in the 16th century. I am not claiming in any way that Luís was unique in this, of course. As already mentioned, books of Problemata were extremely popular and many vernacular editions were published. But I am not attempting here I'm not attempting here a complete characterization of this editorial phenomenon, just noting this aspect of Luís's book, which is, addressing a broad, non-specialist audience and distinguished from any pedagogical concerns. The contents of the book is the following. The Problemata libri quinque is not a commentary on the Aristotelian problems, and its contents do not originate in the Aristotelian problems. Obviously, it takes the Aristotelian problems as the model, but it is an independent composition. Although it follows a comparable sequence, Luís does not address the same set of questions or themes exactly the same set of questions that Aristotle had considered. Luís the author, was certainly aware of the long Problemata tradition. He makes, a long list of authors that he identifies as sources of his books. He sometimes doesn't even, mention some author explicitly, but we can realize that he knew this, that he knew the works in question. This is, for example, the case with Pietro d'Abano, that we know that he mentioned because he refutes some of sentences in the Expositio by Abano. Within the corpus of Problemata literature, this book, Problematum, libri quinque, is evidently much smaller than the high version with the 900 questions. The work is divided, as I said, in 5 books, and each of these further divided in sections and treating a total of 340 questions. And here in the slide, you can see more or less the division. Book 1 is divided in 6 sections, treating a variety of topics that go from man to microcosm, physics, wine, cosmography, animals, plants, etc. Book 2 is divided in 5 sections, treating topics such as sleep, the organs of sense, memory, and also some old customs of Rome. Book 3, divided in 2 sections, addresses theological and scriptural problems, issues that the author calls supernatural philosophy. Book 4 is devoted to medical matters. And finally, Book 5 is devoted to the liberal arts, treating in 3 sections, first astronomy, and in the second section, arithmetic and music, and in the third, grammar and dialectics. As I said before, although the model is the Aristotelian problems, the questions treated by Luís are different. Only in a few instances he refers directly to the Aristotelian text. For example, one very famous question in the Aristotelian problems, question first of book 30 about Atrabilius' men, is treated by António Luís in a series of 14 questions in section 4 of book 1. Here are some examples of the issues and the form given by Luís to his treatment of the questions. So this is one question, and it goes like, why is it that circle-shaped eggs give rise to males, while the more elongated ones give rise to females? And then, perhaps, because the former are exposed to a uniform heat, which spreads everywhere in equal amounts, while those that are conical in shape seem to hatch that way due to the weakness of the heat. So in other words, we have a well-defined question, always presented with why is it, which is followed by an explanatory possibility, always presented with perhaps or maybe because, without a definitive character and as an obvious invitation to further discussion. The issue at stake is not about the possibility of or veracity of the fact that it's firstly mentioned, which is not in doubt. Indeed, usually it is a common and very well-known event, phenomena, or fact. So what is at stake is the cause of that fact in the explanation below. Let us see another example with exactly the same structure. Why do those entering adolescence often bleed from the nose? And then the attempted explanation, perhaps because in this phase of life, there is greater accumulation of this humor, not because it is generated in greater amounts than in children, who not only have equally intense heat, but also have strong natural faculties, but because it is less assimilated, since the body does not grow in the same proportion as in the age that preceded it. Again, a concrete and very real natural phenomenon, very well known, very familiar even, whose cause is then proposed not assertively, but hypothetically. A cause does exist, an explanation does exist, but it is stated solely as possible. The issue is left open with an implicit invitation for the reader to, further discussion or research. A few more examples of questions in which I will not copy the explanatory possibility, but just, so that to transmit the feeling of the work. One question goes like this: why do children have nightmares at night, and especially those who are more gluttonous? Another: why are old people ordinarily plagued by insomnia? Yet another one: why do old people get glaucoma? Why do you usually attack coughs, back pain, flank pain, and back pain in cold weather? Why do you catch this in cold weather? To all of these familiar questions, a possible cause preceded by perhaps is proposed. In many cases, actually, in most cases, the attempts at explanation, at identifying the cause of the phenomenon in discussion, are multiple, and there is no final resolution as to which one is the most appropriate. For example, in this case, why is it that those that are afraid, their hair stands up, and along their arms the hairs harden, as the poet says, with fear the hair became stiff? And this is a quote by Virgil. And then he offers two possibilities of explanation. Perhaps because in fear the meatus closes and the skin tightens, and the hair that was attached with looser roots binds more firmly. Or another possibility, perhaps because since heat wants to reach the interior, some part of the hair is pulled inwards and the smaller part is left outside, and the outer parts cool and condense, and the explanation continues. Here, two possible causes are put forward, but no final decision is made about which is the correct one. Causes are indeed proposed, but the question is left unresolved. Note that the structure is very different from the scholastic questiones model, because the sequence of alternatives is not, a dialectic that reaches a synthetic final judgment. It's not resolved at the end with the presentation of the true answer. Actually, there is never a final resolution. In many cases, there are far more than just two possible causes. Three or four possibilities are common. The question, why is it that those who cultivate the letters are known to be very much given to wine? I mean, I think this should worry some of us, are very much given to wine. This question has no less than six possible answers. That is, as one can see, very focused questions, usually about well-known subjects, and then suggestions for explanation in the form of perhaps because, which is tentatively proposed, sometimes with multiple attempts at explanation and without a final resolution, in a clear invitation to further discussion and critical inquiry. Aristotle himself, in the Topica, described the problems as an exercise in dialectical training. What is important to note is that the process here presented in the Problemata conforms with the Aristotelian conception of knowledge by causes. The explanatory possibilities are possible causes of the phenomenon. The contrast between the type of approach in the great treatises of medical literature and the Problemata is evident. The Problemata have no intent of becoming doctrinal like a treatise. They are not centered around the work of a single author. They expound neither first principles, nor general doctrines, nor systems, nor broad descriptions. They have no doctrinal pretensions, and much less a dogmatic approach. It's exactly the opposite. In the career of António Luís, the distinction between Problemata texts and medical texts was very clear and gave rise to two different works. As mentioned before, in addition to the Problematum libri quinque, Luís published a standard text on medical doctrines, his De Re Medica, which is a long traditional collection of discussions and commentaries on Galen. And these are two very different works, of course. The explanations The causes of the phenomenon presented are advanced as possibilities, sometimes in a web of reasons that add or even partially contradict each other. The work has a very strong heuristic character, and all of it, it's an invitation to reflection, inquiry, speculation. In fact, as we have already pointed out, check the time, yeah. Pointed out, in almost all cases, there is no final answer to what is being asked, not even a single, a sole answer. António Luís explains what is going on in a passage of great importance. And he says, what we understand here as a problem is defined as the search for the unknown cause of a manifest thing. As for example, when we look for the reason why the freezing of teeth caused by acidic fruits can be cured with purslane, or the reason why the belly is warmer in winter, or the reason why Egypt, a warm region, produces cold wines, and other questions of this kind. So it does not seem that those who define a problem as a dubitable question are providing a correct definition, since here the doubt is posed only in relation to the cause, not the thing. Furthermore, the particle or, because in the narration, the different possibilities are separated by or, which we often use in the explanations of problems, is an indication of someone who is not doubting but affirming. For this reason, in my opinion, those who say that Aristotle affirms nothing in the brilliant book of Problems but merely raises doubts are very far from the truth. In other words, as António Luís clearly explains, what is problematic is the identification of the cause, and the text, far from defending a skeptical position, intends to be affirmative, although affirmative about possibilities of causation that are not clearly defined or identified. So let us go now to what I think is the essential point, or at least the one that I want to transmit. Is it possible to understand the popularity and the wide diffusion of the problems genre, uh, by looking at this structure? Is it possible to learn something about the Western intellectual tradition, especially in the medical tradition, but not only by analyzing the fortune of this literary genre? Historians have traditionally underlined the popularity of the question and answer genre as coming from its educational context. A specialist recently wrote the concise question and answer format, questiones et responsiones, with few lines of dispute, was the teaching method which spread from Salerno throughout the schools of the Latin West, becoming the basis of scholarly dispute about physica. Indeed, Brian Lawn, famous 1963 study on the Salernitan questiones repeatedly highlights the popularity of this type of teaching, and the fact that its popularity comes from the educational context. However, this explanation, that is, that the format of the problems had to do with their original context and with a certain kind of pedagogical tradition, while certainly relevant, seems not to go to the heart of the matter, at least in my opinion. In the literature of Problemata, the question is not necessarily associated with a student, and the answer is not identified as being from a teacher. It is plausible that this genre was used in a classroom setting. In fact, we know that the problemata were not very much used at universities, but we can imagine that some was. But all historical evidence shows a wide dissemination, first handwritten and then printed, that took place outside of a pedagogical context. In other words, the pedagogical use of these texts was most likely responsible for part of their dissemination, but it does not seem, at least to me, relevant enough to explain the immense popularity of these texts. To go, directly to the Problematum libri quinque, and as I said before, nothing in the text of Problematum libri quinque hints at a pedagogical use, quite the contrary. A closer look forces one to look specifically at the form of these texts. In the Problemata literature, as we have explained before, the form is simple, and is always repeated, a very concise question answered with exploratory arguments. To realize the importance of this fact is necessary to make a slight explanatory deviation and to, recall known methods. I will need, I think, 5 minutes more. As we all know, so one of the most enduring legacies of the Aristotelian organon was the presentation of a definition of certain knowledge, or as later called scientific knowledge. Aristotle calls it epistemic. The full development of this notion is found in posterior analytics. There, Aristotle explained that when we think we know of a certain thing without qualification, that we know a certain thing without qualifications, when we think we know the cause why that thing is. And I think this is all very familiar to all. That is the cause of the thing and that it cannot be otherwise. So there is a univocal one-to-one relation between phenomenon and cause. Okay. Certain knowledge is causal knowledge, causal, but in the precise sense of identifying in a completely unambiguous way the cause of the phenomenon. Natural philosophy was, as we know, built on this requirement. Just a few words of caution. What I have just described, I know that it's somewhat simplified. It is well known that Aristotle uses the term episteme with some ambivalence. And it's also known that in Physica and the anima are constructed in a way which is not exactly concordant with the posterior analytic programs, etc. But be that as it may be, there is also no doubt that at least as an ideal, Aristotelianism presented a true program for understanding the natural world, an ideal which consisted in asserting that the true understanding of any element or phenomenon in the natural world, required an effort to identify its cause as the single unique cause. Thinkers who looked at natural phenomena sought to uncover unique causes that could explain those phenomena. However, what some reflection makes one suspect, and the historical data seems to confirm, is that this requirement, the limitation of an epistemic requirement on the knowledge of nature, can be too demanding, too stringent. There are many certain and well-known things about the world for which we cannot identify the cause. Demanding the strict application of an epistemic criterion would invalidate the security and the usefulness of such knowledge. The point I'm trying to explore is precisely this. Given that the requirement of causal knowledge became the cornerstone, at least ideally, for obtaining certain authoritative knowledge in the West, and given that this requirement, if used in a strict and exclusive manner, could render useless vast areas of true and useful knowledge, were there historically strategies to overcome this problem, this stringency, let us say? That is, to adopt causal explanations while at the same time loosening a little bit Aristotle's strictures. The importance and the popularity of Problemata literature seems therefore to have been exactly this. At least to me, it provided an intellectual legitimate way of investigating the natural world that did not require the univocal and precise identification of the cause of phenomena. With this, without losing the most significant of the European tradition, the primacy of causal knowledge, it freed the investigation of the natural world from the straitjacket imposed by the direct and scrupulous application of Aristotelian logic. The scholar and researcher of nature continued to operate according to the categories of causal knowledge and therefore could invoke methodological legitimacy and a certain degree of certainty to the explanations. But the cause was presented in an argumentative, plural, hypothetical, and even undetermined manner. The question, why is it, continued to operate within the parameters of good explanation. It turned out, however, that the cause of the phenomenon was not immediately identifiable, at least in a unique way. Not surprisingly, it was above all a certain type of topics and a certain type of subjects that gave rise to, and to a certain extent forced, this methodological expansion. These were not questions on mathematics or astronomy or cosmography, but but especially problems on, medicine, literature, or the natural world. It was mainly questions on medicine, physiology, psychology, meteorology that, due to extreme complexity, even today, they are complex, forced to attenuate the requirements of the posterior analytics. Because in these disciplines, the phenomena or effects are well known and have often been observed and are well established, and because they inhabit an interpretative space with a very high reputation, what was needed was an approach that could legitimize explanations in which the single cause is not identified, either because it is not completely possible to establish as the cause or because only multiple causes are conceivable. And I reach to the final conclusions to end. As it happens, historians have already noted some of the phenomena that I'm suggesting here. As Craig Martin showed, a comparable situation happened in the case of Aristotle's meteorology. Several intellectuals, such as Agostino Nifo, Pietro Pomponazzi, and Niccolò Cabeo, argued that the Aristotelian ideal was not applicable to meteorology, saying that causal explanations in meteorology were conjectural, provisional, and probabilistic. The consequences of this were very interesting, as Martin showed. This inferior epistemological standard turned out to have a positive effect as it contributed to the Aristotelians of the time being willing to revise meteorological theories and depart from Aristotle's thesis on meteorology. Instead of attempting a broad analysis of the very rich Problemata literature in the 16th century, a task which others have already done to a great extent and for which I do not feel competent, I've proposed in this presentation the examination of one single book within that tradition. My objective was mostly to stress that the importance of the Problemata, and perhaps part of the explanation for the popularity of this genre, should be seen against the background of the deep tensions and transformations that Aristotelianism was undergoing in 16th century Europe. Many of these transformations were at the level of first principles and methodology. Problemata literature gave both popularity and authoritative status to an approach that at the same time maintained the fundamental Aristotelian requirement of causal explanations while allowing for and even promoting argumentative, hypothetical, and multiple possibilities of explanation. Thank you very much.